my name's Robert. As Carlos said, I'm here to talk to you about how to be a 10x analyst. And so let's get right into it. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm here in a second, but let's get to the punchline because that's the meaty part of this. So it's actually quite simple. To be a 10x analyst, you simply need to make everyone else 10x less effective. This is your simplest and most surefire strategy. After all, relative effectiveness is a ratio metric, and we're all analytics-minded people here. Ratio metrics are often more drivable through the denominator, right? So while you can increase your own effectiveness, it's often way more effective to decrease the effectiveness of everyone else by sabotaging their work. Here's a plot that drives this home. Sorry, I can't get through this with a straight face. All right, so your effectiveness is on the y-axis, average effectiveness is on the x-axis, and you have this 10x analyst line, this contour line, along which you have constant relative effectiveness. Notice if you decrease average effectiveness, you yourself have to be less effective commensurately, making your job easier. So even if you don't want to sabotage your team, you still should, because it'll make your job easier. So, all right, so I have 2 tips for you, and then we'll end the talk. One, encourage others to work on interesting projects with ambiguous value. So a great way to do this is to simply nerd snipe people. For example, you might say, hey, John, I read this amazing 17-page paper on causal attribution. You should use this on your dashboard. Number 2, make it so your work can't be reused by anybody else. So for this, I like to implement a strategy of just making only dashboards and trying to make as many as I can. So this has 2 advantages. One, dashboards are a little contextless, so people can't actually read anything or understand what you're doing. But 2, it creates the needle in the haystack problem for people. So you can end up just forcing them to sift through thousands of things, and they'll never be able to find your work. All right. Here's a sabotage manual from the CIA. So lots of great tips here. You should make speeches, bring up irrelevant issues, haggle over precise wording. The lever that this is pointing to is to simply waste time. I'd say take this with a grain of salt. Don't use it too much because obviously we're dealing with a ratio metric. If you decrease both the numerator and denominator, you won't actually increase your relative effectiveness. Okay, so obviously I'm kidding, and sorry for that ridiculous bit. But I bring this up for 2 reasons, and I start the talk like this for 2 reasons. One is because a lot of the levers that I pointed out that you can use to really push down your team are the same levers that we can use to push up your team and actually become a more effective analyst. But I'll get to that during the course of this talk. And secondly, I want to distance myself a bit from this concept of the 10x engineer, which is what this talk has derived its name from. So if you aren't familiar with the cultural ethos or the cultural context behind this term, this tweet by Shekhar Karani, I'm going to throw him under the bus a bit, really captures this in my opinion. He's basically figured out here's a bunch of proxy behaviors that these 10x engineers follow, and let me characterize them just by these proxy metrics. So he says stuff like, 10x engineers don't go to meetings. They think it's a waste of time. 10x engineers are extremely irregular. They don't work when other people are around. 10x engineers have black laptop background screens. I thought this was satire when I first read it, but I think it really just points to the fact that we've developed this culture within engineering where 10x engineers are viewed as only technical. Only technical prowess is valued above all else, right? At the expense of everything else. And as a result, we've tolerated these extremely toxic behaviors. Basically, like if you watch Silicon Valley, like the Guilfoyles of Silicon Valley, right? Yes, they are incredibly intelligent, but everything else that they do is absolutely terrible and reduces productivity. Now, obviously, being an amazing technical contributor is a great thing. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't try to do that. But even if you subscribe to that notion for engineering, my main point here is that this has no place in analytics. And this will basically be the thrust of the talk. So the primary reason I'm arguing for this is that our strongest levers are not technical. So unlike engineering, where you're often given a project, you have to execute on that project in the most elegant way possible and then deliver that to production, we have this whole workflow that exists outside of just doing the technical work, right? So on one side of it, on the conception side of things, we are our own PMs, right? We are the ones who dictate our own roadmap, unless you have a data PM or something like that. Meaning that unless you believe that PMs are absolutely useless, there's a very strong lever here to do prioritization against your own work. Secondly, on the consumption side of things, obviously we're an interfacial discipline, right? Like engineers, they can just ship to prod, done. I mean, they might have bugs, they might have QA to do, but for the most part, it's just production grade, right? It's production ready. But for us, our work is interfacial. We work with stakeholders, but it's also contingent, right? Like our work is, the value of our work is predicated on its reception and its use by other people. Like we're not the ones making decisions, we're not the ones driving strategy, but we are constructing the knowledge ecosystems within which other people are able to make those decisions, drive that strategy. So there's a lot of value there as well, unless, of course, you believe your executives are not valuable, but that's another talk. So all in all, my point here is analytics is not purely a technical domain. So the concept of a 10x engineer, the purely technical engineer doesn't quite fit here. So how do we be 10x analysts? I really love this tweet by Andrew Theriault where he says, if you define 10x in terms of code, you're doing it wrong. The extra contribution comes from being really great at something other than code. So domain, architecture, product, something like that. During this talk, I will explore what those are and give you my take on what I believe those levers are. All right, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. Carlos gave me a great introduction, so I'll just breeze through this. But as he mentioned, I was in grad school. This is where I got my start in data. I call this my terrible life choice time of life. I studied rivers, which was fantastic, but I also stole a lot of food from graduate school seminars, survived off of that. Eventually got a life raft to a company called Wayfair, where I did a lot of causal inference work, causal uplift modeling. You might know me from an uplift modeling library that I created called PyLift. I then went on to Airbnb. This was my I want to be closer to the business phase. Got to work in more general data science, got to do a bit of causal inference as well, but also got to be very close to the product analytics side of things, which was a lot of fun. Got to open source some stuff along the way as well. While doing the product analytics things, I realized that the workflow here was horrendous, and so I went over to the dark side, and I became a founder. Also a PM, so I guess I'm like doubly on the dark side. So I'm at Hyperquery. I co-founded this with a couple folks, and we're building a data notebook purpose-built for analytics, purpose-built to solve the problems in analytics. I'll get into that very briefly at the end. But yeah, basically I'm a PM now. That's why the axes aren't labeled. That's my excuse. All right, so let's talk about how to be a 10x analyst. Before I really get into this, I want to give you all a disclaimer. I use Twitter to crowdsource this talk. So if you're a pessimist, you can view this as, oh my God, he cheated. If you're an optimist, you can view this as like wisdom of the crowds. I'm just, thank you. All right, let's move on. But if you see a bunch of tweets, this is why, because I'm a few of you are actually in here, so maybe I'll call you out, maybe I won't. So the eigen question below, how do we be a 10x analyst, is what are we actually 10xing even? So I want to approach this from a more like analytics analysis perspective. I really love this tweet by Drew Moxon where he says like, is this a talk where the real meta question is hidden? How do you measure the impact of a data team? And this is so right. We need to define this first. We need to correctly think about what is our objective, then define the metric, et cetera, et cetera. So our objective, plain and simple, is business value, right? And I'm going to pause because I mean, for me at least, this isn't, this is something that we know in our heart of hearts, but we often don't really think about. We don't internalize, we don't actually act on. But if you're not providing business value, you're not providing business value, right? So tautologically, you need to be providing business value. So I think we all know that. Let's move on. But I'm going to break this down in a way that I think you guys haven't seen before. This is like a common breakdown in analytics. You break down a metric into its drivers. In this case, I'm going to break down business value into impact times reach. So I think we're all familiar with impact, effect on top line metrics. How much revenue did you drive as an analytics team? that's already really hard to measure, and I'm happy to talk about them more later. But this side of it is basically just Dirac delta impulse effect on your metrics, right? What decision did you impact? What outcome did you help drive? What decision did you help make? And then on the other side of things, I'm introducing this term, which is reach. So this is how many people, how many decisions did this scalably impact? And this is a less commonly thought of driver, but just as important nonetheless. Like if you can drive some impact yourself, that's fantastic. But if you can get someone else to also take that learning and drive that impact as well, obviously you've just doubled your impact, right? So this is a strong lever as well. So if we all agree to this, it's a talk, so you guys can't disagree. Let's just move on. Then the answer is quite simple. To be a 10x analyst, you just have to pursue impact. You have to pursue reach, right? You have to take these two drivers and you pump them both up. So for the rest of the talk, I will go through these and talk about how to actually drive impact, how to actually drive reach. All right. A quick step back to to remind you of the ridiculous bit that I had in the beginning. If you look at I promise you that if you look at the things that I said were ways to sabotage your team, they're actually ways to lift up your team as well. So I just wanted to go through those and just validate that for you. So encourage others to work on interesting projects with ambiguous value. This is basically driving down the impact of others, right? While on the other hand, you could encourage people to work on things that are important, right? But this is obviously a trap that we often fall into as analysts. We're like, hey, shiny new object, let's go do that because that's cool and that will make me learn things. But in reality, you shouldn't do that, right? Number two, make it so your work can't be reused by anyone else. This is a reach problem, right? You're pushing down the impact of your work to reach other people. Obviously, if you just flip that on its head, you'll end up with better reach. So, all right. So I'll go through each one of these two drivers in turn, and then we'll talk about some more general aspects of this. So let's talk about how to maximize impact. So the punchline is quite simple. You just got to pursue and prioritize your work by impact as best as you can, of course, right? I really love this tweet by Lauren Balick. So she says, so in response to my tweet about like how do you be a 10x analyst, she says you should report into the C-suite and them alone. If you get bogged down with line of business dashboards and stuff, you're doomed to that. Your value decays with each nth analysis, and this this is freaking ridiculous. So I when I first heard this, I laughed. I was like, this is absurd. No one can just do that. But she has a point, right? And this is something we often don't think about. If you're making decisions, say on higher strata, you just end up having higher impact, right? Like you can imagine, let's say you were in a customer service domain. If you're working as an IC, the greatest impact you'll have is a few percentage points when you do a deep dive analysis on an experiment, right? But then if you're reporting into the C-suite, what did I just do? Oh, okay. If you're reporting into the C-suite, then the level of decision that you're making is like, should we completely axe customer service or should we not? Should we drive double the amount of resources into it or not, right? And so suddenly you're working within margins of like 0 to 200% lift, right? Well, okay, don't kill me. Again, I'm a PM. Don't kill me on the hand wavy metrics. So let's move on. So the general point though that Lauren is making is actually quite good. Not that this point isn't good. This is quite good as well. But she's pointing to basically Pareto law, right? Power law, 80-20 rule. So the basic idea is that if you look at all of the work that you've done, about 20% of them will drive 80% of the outcomes, right? Very roughly speaking. And if you were to actually do this, if you were to take, and believe me, like I've actually done this. I'm sure you guys can do this exercise yourself. You go through and you look at a distribution of all the projects that you've worked on as an analyst, and you rank order them. You'll find that there's this very thin slice of projects that actually drove substantial value for your business. And so given that the answer is really you should figure out how to seek out these projects, right? You should figure out how to seek out these projects and capture that 20% effort. And I'd say it's even more ridiculous, right? Like I've had a lot of work as an analyst where I'm like, oh yeah, I just answered a bunch of ad hoc requests for like 4 months, and this drove absolutely no impact, right? And I'm sure a lot of you have felt the same. Now, the problem is that this is easier said than done. And I'm here on my high horse giving this talk about this, but in reality, I've never done this. So let's go to story time. I'll tell you a little bit about my time at Airbnb, which really spurred my doubt in our ability to do this collectively. So when I was at Airbnb, I got pushed to work on Australia, right? My like data management, analytics management was like, Australia is the golden land. This is where all the opportunities are for our business. Let's go to Australia. Let's analyze Australia. So I looked. I went back to my managers, my data executives, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, there's nothing here. There's nothing here. They were like, keep looking, keep looking. There's something there. So I kept looking, and I even went to Australia. I talked to researchers. I talked to actual hosts in Australia. And at the end of the day, like 3 months later, I found that the amount of impact was zero. It was zero. The impact was zero. There was nothing there. And I mean, this was like, you guys know like the phrase, if you torture data enough, it'll confess, right? Like, who's heard of that phrase? Okay, great. So the common phrase, this was like the Liam Neeson from Taken of data sets. It was, what was that quote? It was like, I have a particular set of skills. I will find you. I will look for you. I will find you and I will waste your time. That was this data set. And at the end of the day, I was like, okay, I wasted 3 months on this. This is absolutely absurd. But also my managers, my leadership, they all encouraged me to keep prying here. I think this points to this systemic problem that we don't know what we're doing. Like basically, I went down this rabbit hole and I dug into this, right? I was like, why did I waste my time? You guys tell me why I wasted my time on this. And it came down to like, Australians call things different words, and that probably leads to a bad user experience. And I was like, what the hell? Basically, I went down a rabbit hole because Australians call ADUs granny flats, right? And they thought that this is where all the opportunity was. And so I started to get this inkling that perhaps data people don't have great product intuition. And then I went down a very, very dark rabbit hole. So I'll continue with this slideshow. So what I did next is I prioritized all of our projects, or I looked at all of our projects and I rank ordered them by what we were excited about, and then rank ordered them also by what was the most impactful. So within the last year, what we'd done. And the first thing you might notice is that nothing in the left column is actually in the right column. So there was just really, I didn't do a rigorous analysis on this, but there was basically no correlation, right? At the end of the day, you can see the Australia thing here, a couple other projects we were excited about here. We ended up working on all these things and heavily investing in all these things that we were personally very excited about, that we personally thought were interesting and maybe impactful at the same time. But our most impactful projects were quite different. So just to read off a couple of these, the single most impactful thing that we did was we found that in India, the address bar was just covering the submit button. So we fixed that. It was a basic, simple funnel analysis, right? We also looked into our live chat. We realized that on a deep dive, there was actually no real value there. So we canceled that, saving millions of dollars. This last one, I think you can probably all guess, but Airbnb during COVID is a really difficult business to be in. So understatement, right? You can imagine if the CDC is telling you don't get near anyone or you will die, you don't really want to stay in anyone else's houses. So during the pandemic, a big analytics project that we did was we just tried to figure out where we could drive targeted supply to try to save the business. And maybe it contributed to us riding the storm, right? I don't know what the measure of value there is, but maybe it's the entire business. I don't want to attribute too much value to analytics, though, so let's move on. But the point here is prioritizing by impact is it's hard, right? Like a full team of us, we just weren't very good at this. We basically tend to get distracted by shiny objects, right? We know that impact is our North Star, but rarely is that common in our discourse, in our daily prioritization, right? So how to do it? Just do it. and I'm going to repeat this a few times. Just do it. Just prioritize. Just do. I feel like that GIF. But really, just prioritize by impact, right? And I think it needs to be said, just because we just really tend not to think about it, right? When we're bogged down in operational details, in reactivity, in working with our stakeholders and making them happy, we just forget that this is important and completely throw it out the window, right? So obviously, that's not particularly useful. So I'll give you a couple tips. And this is all really common advice, but I'm going to tie it back to how it can help you with impact. So that way it's a little bit more tangible. Tip 1, get business acumen. So this is one of the most important things. I think a lot of people say you should have domain expertise. You should think about the business. You should have full context on the business. But that's helpful in a number of ways. But one of the strongest levers is that it can just help you identify what's high leverage and what's not, right? Like if you actually understand the business, you can figure out, hey, this one actually resonates with a lot of the customer requests that we're getting or a lot of the user research that we've been doing. Maybe we should work on that first, right? Number 2, seek analysis, business fit. Obviously, on the other end of things, our work isn't valuable until it's actually used. So rather than just creating something in a silo and delivering it, what you can do is really focus on seeking, on creating something that's actually tangibly useful to the rest of your organization, right? Work with your stakeholders directly, figure out what they need, make sure that what the decisions that they're making will actually be informed by your work, not just, you don't just create something that's interesting to yourself. All right, so part 2, let's talk about how to maximize reach. So I'll start with 2 really obvious statements here. Again, I mean, this whole talk is pretty obvious, so hopefully it's just digging out things that you guys already know in the depths of your heart. But 1, analyses are more useful when discoverable. Number 2, dashboards are more useful when maintained. So the best way to get reach, then, is to figure out how to make sure that your work is useful in these ways to other people, right? And so for analyses, this means you should be sharing and centralizing your work. So really figuring out how it might be used to drive other patterns of usage, inspire other analyses, impact other decisions, how the learnings can be transferred, et cetera, et cetera. And then for dashboards, just maintain the service, right? Just make less dashboards and just make sure they don't break, so that way people don't have to sift through thousands of dashboards like I mentioned before, right? Make sure they feel they can trust this to self-serve themselves. I want to point this out because I really love this Chuck Cassius tweet where he says, I think there's generally an outsized focus on individual performance in all of US culture. I found that my best work is one done in graceful concert with another person or a small group where our contributions blend and amplify. I love this because I think we don't all internalize how much of an impact just disseminating our work, evangelizing our work, sharing it with others, inspiring other people can actually help. I mean, we basically have this network of people, and if you were to just get one other person to have the same lift that you did, then obviously if everyone were to do that, there's an exponential increase, right, in your value. All right, so to sum up everything, 3 main points that I wanted you to get out of this talk. 1, you should be prioritizing your work by impact. And the best way to do this, and the best tip I have for you, is to invest in business acumen to make sure you can identify the high leverage projects. Number 2, make sure your impactful work is actually used. So work very closely alongside the rest of the business to make sure context is transferred. There's a very, very tight coupling between how your work will be used, it's delivered well, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, make sure your work is useful to others. So for analyses, document them, and then for dashboards, maintain them. All right, so one last point that I want to make is I just want to flip these on their head and point to the problems that these point to and just have a more like macroscopic discussion about this. So prioritize by impact. The root evil behind this is like we just are bad at prioritizing. In terms of pushing you to align with your stakeholders better, the problem that this points to is we have poor alignment. And then on the like making your work useful to others, the problem that this points to is just chaos. Like we have just utter chaos in our teams, right? Now, the problem here is imagine you're a product manager, right? And you're you see a data team that functions like this, you'd be like, okay, they can't figure out what to work on. They don't actually drive much value. They don't align with me to figure out what I believe that they should do. And everything is chaotic. I can't find any of the things that they've done. If you put yourself in that person's shoes, you would just obviously be like, okay, well, I can't trust the analytics team, right? So overall, this, I think, is the pattern of behavior that leads to this terrible reactivity, this degradation of trust that we have with our stakeholders, right? We end up becoming service orgs rather than being the powerhouse behind our organization that we could be if we were to function really, really seamlessly. This leads to overreactivity. We end up being SQL monkeys. We end up being pulled into these meetings where our only role is to act as a SQL mechanic, just pushing the button and getting data out, right? So this is, I want to point to this because this is not just, obviously, like I want you all to be 10x analysts, but there's a bigger battle that we're fighting, right? And this is like the battle of our domain. We want to make sure that we are really transforming how the organization works, right? There's organization-wide repercussions here. So do it. So just do these things, okay? It'll help all of us. That's my point. So with that said, I wanted to give a little bit of advice to leads and managers, those who are in a managerial position. For those of you who are familiar with the 10x engineer trope, you probably have heard of the idea that, yeah, you don't want to just make yourself 10x, you could just make 10 other people 2x, and then that achieves the same goal. The point there being that managers have a really outsized opportunity to drive this sort of leverage across their organization. So 2 bits of advice that I'd push for. One, mentor others to think in this way. Sorry. Excuse me. Mentor others to think in this way. And I think you would think that this would be obvious, but again, Australia example, it's not always obvious. Sometimes your managers will mentor you to torture data instead. Just please don't do that to your reports. It's very discouraging. And secondly, I'd encourage you to make this easier for everyone. So obviously there's a philosophy here. Below that, there are processes and rituals that you can implement to reduce the friction to complying with this sort of behavior, right? Maybe make templates, maybe make documentation. Basically, ingrain this so that way it's standard practice. All these things are standard practice. Force alignment with your stakeholders, right? Force people to ask why, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so that's the end of the talk. And now I'm going to tell you about Hyperquery because, again, I'm a founder and I want to sell things to you. So I'm the chief product officer and co-founder of Hyperquery. And obviously, I believe in everything above. But you can choose whether or not to believe me or not. We make it easier to do 10x work. So obviously, we can't solve all of your problems for you. That's ridiculous. We can't solve prioritization for you. You have to do that yourself. But we did build this from the ground up to make it a lot easier to reduce the friction to doing a lot of these things that are better behaviors. So we make it easier to share work. We make it easier to organize, centralize work. Basically, just dropping the friction to make it so doing the things that make you 10x are actually simple. If you have questions about this, let me know. You can visit hyperquery.ai to learn more, or just come find me, and I will always talk about this as much as you want. All right, that's it. Thanks for your time.